Hello and welcome to Real Time Recorded. It's week 30, 2022. Hello, Zeus. How you doing?
This is quite a week, isn't it, Dave? For halfway through the summer.
You know, this episode's going to be about financials, and we could, this whole year. Forget this week. This whole year is about financials. I just saw that Amazon posted a $2 billion loss.
Yeah.
As shoppers return to stores, which kind of a weird excuse, but valid. Apple profits are down 11% due to supply chain. I mean, it's just like, the sky's falling, right?
Yeah, Facebook had its first quarter of lower revenue ever, right? So.
Yeah, so that's what they call the macro scene, right? The macro scene is not healthy, but let's get into the micro scene of a couple of our favorite enterprise comms companies. So let's start off with 8x8. See, that's the funny thing about all these companies we're going to cover is they're all different quarters. So 8x8 is quarter one of 2022.
Yeah.
But they actually had a pretty decent quarter. What do you think?
It was okay. They had some good bright spots there, right? The Microsoft Teams attached business is up, which is what you would expect given the Teams momentum is high. They did note some weakness due to the macro, which I think is what everybody's going to say now. Their enterprise business is up, which again we would expect with Fuse being fully integrated now. They bought that to move their enterprise business up, but I do think they issued some cautionary warnings about the rest of the calendar year, which does make me wonder. They didn't, while they lowered the guide for next quarter, they didn't bring the full year guide down, which I would have thought they might have. But they're a company like all the companies in our space, Dave, that's going through some kind of transition. They're still trying to bring.
So one of the things about the macro economy is that apparently the rules are changing, and I don't know. I don't get these memos when the memos go out, but apparently the rules are changing, and now there's a much more stronger focus on profitability than growth, and so it's been growth for the last decade or so. So the memo went out, focus on profitability. So. And 8x8's responding appropriately. They actually reported a profit, right?
Yeah.
Earnings per share of 9 cents, and that beat by 40 cents, and so that's good. That's good profit. The revenue of 187 million was also a beat, and even though they downplayed, like you said, the revised their forecast, they're still up 26% year over year.
Yeah.
And so I think that they're overall doing really well. And so this transition about focusing on profitability is going to be a recurring theme as we go through these different companies today. And I think they're sandbagging. I don't know. I think they're doing pretty well. No CEO is going to get in trouble for lowering the forecast right now.
Yeah.
And you never want to miss a quarter, period. And if you are going to miss a quarter, you're better off missing high than missing low. And so I think they're sandbagging. What do you think?
I don't know if they're sandbagging. Sipes is a pretty financially oriented guy, but I do think if you are going to correct your numbers, you're better off correcting it now when everybody else is, right? So 8x8 doing that under the shadows of Amazon, Apple, and Facebook is, They're such a small part of the overall economy compared to those three big companies, right? So, even Netflix has taken a pretty big hit, right? So, if you are going to correct, now is the time. I would do it now versus, trying to do
I agree. Now, a couple of things they highlighted in the quarter that I think are worth highlighting. They highlighted their partnership with Genesis. I think there's something to that partnership with Genesis. I wonder if these companies are moving closer and closer together, and I think there's some synergy for both companies if they continue to move together. So I'm excited about that one. I think their XCAS story is holding water. I think that we've been seeing that for a while. They had an interesting line in their the way they described their company. They said, I'm going to quote them here: the only fully owned, unified cloud-based UC and contact center platform. That's a pretty bold statement. It's certainly true amongst the bigger players. I'm sure there's some smaller players that might have that claim as well. But
Dialpad would claim that. WebEx would claim that, right? So Microsoft probably would now too, although I do think those are separate products. But everyone, I guess it depends on how you define it, I suppose. But
Yeah.
and to your point, though, I am fascinated to see how these companies, if you look at, Zoom and Ring in particular, they grew. I mean, Zoom spent so much money during their growth phase on sales and marketing, right? So the focus is now on profitability. It's Wall Street has to get slapped on the hand every now and then, right? They reward growth at all costs, and then every once in a while they correct themselves and go, well, maybe profits are important.
Every once in a while, like I said, the memo goes out, and I don't get the memo. I want to know when these rules change. But when these rule changes happen, a lot of companies get stuck in the glue trap, right? I mean, these are multi-year strategies, and if you are, all of a sudden the focus is on profitability, and you're not profitable, that's a hard gear to change into. Fortunately, 8x8 was profitable, so I think they're going to do all right. Let's move on to company number 2, Five9. They did Q2 2022. Another one that beat estimates, raised, and this time they raised their guidance. What do you think of that?
Yeah, they're a beat and raise machine, right? They do this every quarter. I've accused Barry of having the easiest job in Silicon Valley because he knows 95% of his number going into the quarter, right? So there's very little variability in what Five9 thinks and what they're going to do. And so, some of the positives, though, they have, they continue to increase enterprise business, right? And that's really the goal for all the UCaaS, CCaaS vendors cut their teeth, small market, mid market, and now they're all trying to move up market. I think for Five9, are 41% they saw 41% subscription growth in enterprise, which is really strong for them. And so, although their definition of enterprise is smaller than what some of the bigger companies might be, but
but it's getting bigger. I mean, they're one of the CCaaS companies that's really consistently building traction with larger and larger implementations. And this quarter, their Q2 revenue of $189.38 million is actually a company record, and they beat expectations by 9.3. What is that? 5%, something like that. So pretty strong results. And then different than 8x8, they actually upped their forecast, like we talked about there. So and reasonably significant, right? That they upped the forecast to $780.5 million to $782.5 million, and it was previously at $770 to $773. So quite a bit there.
What's shocking though is even with the strong numbers, the stock's up. I'm looking 12% right now. Stock's at $110. Market cap's back up to $7.67. It is half of what it was a year ago. And this is, they are the class of the CCaaS space, which shows just how much this market has corrected itself in that time. I certainly don't think Five9 is a $12, $13 billion market cap company, but they're, given the growth, they're probably more than 7.6 right now too. But they just I don't. It's been a long time since I've seen a correction like this before, but it's all these, UCaaS.
I don't know. It seems like a correction like this happens every time I buy stocks. But anyway, I wanted to quote Rowan here because he's doubling down to your point. He basically says, let's see, despite the macro environment uncertainties, so starting out, but despite that, we continue to experience strong growth with second quarter record bookings for both new logos and our installed base. Now he in the narrative that they presented during the results, he says he's very bullish for 4 reasons. He says that the premise systems are continuing to get older. They're still seeing a lot of companies that are replacing the premises systems. He says the need to automate is getting stronger. That one actually, because they've really doubled down on automation, and I think that that holds true in a tight economy. Needs to automate are getting stronger. He talked about the large customers, the market, especially large customers, accelerating their transition. So he sees that as a good sign for them. And then this last one is kind of interesting. He cites international expansion, and I think Five9 of all the CCaaS companies is kind of pegged to North America and tightly associated with North America. They've been expanding in UK and broader Europe slowly on their terms, but they are primarily a North American company, and if they're really focusing on international expansion, world is their oyster.
Yeah, the other kind of interesting data point I took out of that was the 335% new logo growth with respect to AI features, right? And AI at Five9 is an interesting sort of set of features because whenever we talk to them, I don't think they fully understand yet what they're going to monetize, what's free, what becomes part of the feature set. And I think, the CCaaS industry in particular is just starting to scratch the surface on the monetization of AI. I'm still a big believer that AI creates another step function in growth for this market. So, the TAM that we've all been thinking they're playing with, I think is much bigger as we just start to see AI do things that you couldn't do before, right?
I agree with that. I think it's a good point. The other thing we have to give them a little crap here for Zeus is that they're very proud of almost being Five9s, right? And so they've made a number of technology improvements to their platform. I mean, they've really, this has been a multi-year initiative. I think they referred it to their R&D as paying off. But they're often referred to as legacy cloud because they were one of the first ones, but they've really been upgrading things. And they are boasting that they are at 4 nines, 99.998%, which they say is 53 seconds a month of downtime, which is impressive and great. And I don't want to rain on their parade, but you have to say something because the company's called Five9. So,
well, it rounds up to 5.9.
It rounds up to 5. But yeah, so the R&D is paying off, and so that's nice to see that. And I'm also, I think it's also really noteworthy that their focus on upmarket and larger implementations are really coming together very nicely. So not a bad quarter.
All right, well, let's talk about the big news, Dave. So late last night, I think you and I both saw that Avaya announced that longtime CEO Jim Chirico has been there for 5 years, and 10 years before that, actually, as head of sales, is stepping down, and in comes Alan Nazarick, who we all know is the former CEO of Vonage, who actually took a company that nobody. When Alan joined Vonage, I didn't even think about Vonage, right? They were
a consumer.
Yeah. Woo-hoo. We all remember that jingle, right? And built a pretty strong company that Roy Reid then eventually flipped to Ericsson for a little over $6 billion. And so this is about as different a personality as you can get for CEOs. Alan is very much a builder, uses acquisitions. Jim likes to kind of build within. He didn't do very well with acquisitions. Jim's very kind of numbers process oriented. Alan, in fact, I think Alan left, Vonage when that discipline became more important, right? And Rory Reid came in and did that. So now, in conjunction with that, they also pre-announced a pretty significant miss. For $550 on revenue, I think on a $700 million guide, and the EBITDA was even bigger. I think they came in at a third of where they were supposed to be. So I think the clock ran out on Jim, right? And he's done a lot of good things at that company. In fact, if he had left a year ago, we probably would have been surprised. The fact that they've had a tumultuous last couple of quarters, I think it's no surprise. Yeah,
it's really been an interesting conversation. There's lots of different pieces to this conversation. So the first conversation, let's do it in order of press release. Actually, the first press release was the preliminary results of Q3. And it was interesting because they didn't mention the CEO change in that press release. 5 minutes later, they issued another press release about the CEO change. So let's take the preliminary results first. You mentioned 550. I think it was actually they put a range out, 575 to 580. Yeah. And that was compared to guidance of 685 to 700. And remember, they lowered their guidance in the last quarter. So this is like a double whammy. And the weird thing about this one, Zeus, is that they didn't offer any kind of explanation. I mean, we just talked about, Apple's down because of supply chain, Amazon's down because people are going back to stores. There was no explanation of why this was such a big miss. And so the obvious conclusion is a leadership explanation because the very next press release 5 minutes later was they're changing leaders. But that there's no. It would have been nice if they would have said some sort of what's going on here. So Any thoughts on the preliminary before we get into the CEO change a little more?
No, I think macro, it definitely caught up to them. I also think that there's a factor of play here where a lot of the subscription revenue they've been growing was flipping their install base, right? And so I think we've all been kind of cautiously looking out of one eye, wondering when that source of subscription revenue would come to an end. Now, they have been building other customers, right? But those were all new subscription customers. And so if you look at some of the metrics they track, much of it did come from the install base. So I suspect that probably played a part in it. I also know that they had to take Russia numbers off the board, right? They stopped doing business in that. And I think they are the primary telecom vendor to almost every major business in Russia, right? And that also included Belarus and some of the other neighboring countries. And so there's a lot of macro factors in play. I think the biggest surprise, Dave, isn't that they didn't put them in this press release, that they didn't talk about them more last quarter, right? Because a lot of these macro issues we've known have been out there for a while. So there was quite a bit of uncertainty that I think they could have brought some clarity to earlier.
So then the second press release, as you'd already described, is Alan Massaris coming in as the CEO and president. Now, the thing that struck me on this one was the immediacy. I mean, he's starting. The press release went out on Thursday after hours, and he's starting his first day on Monday. There's a short overlap with Jim as an employee, but I mean, this is a very, very quick announcement. I mean, it's not like he's starting in a month or two. I mean, he's starting immediately. So the thing that stands out to me is, I mean, obviously they had started the search and been negotiating and whatever with Alan for quite some time, and I don't think there was any indication of that. So it seems like it's a result of this previous press release about the missed quarter, but obviously this has been going on for a while. So any thoughts on that, Zeus?
Yeah, well, you don't go hire a CEO in 2 days, right? So it's not like you put something on Indeed.com and find the next person. So I do think the search has been on probably, I got to think, the better part of a couple of months. I would think that, Avaya is sort of an interesting company. They got a big install base. They've done under Chirico, they've done a lot to kind of convert the revenue, like we talked about the cloud, all the caps, metrics they track. But the one thing they've never been able to do is grow at a rate that's even close to market rate. Right now, in defense of Jim, no CEO before him actually has ever managed to grow. Right. In fact, he told me that in the 15 years he's been there, they've never put up a growth quarter. Right. So they did do that for a couple of times, but it's always like low single digits and stuff. And I think eventually the board had to look at, they got to make a change and bring somebody in that can stimulate some growth. And that's what Alan did at Vonage. So I do think you're right. I think this has been in the works for a while. I just think it coincided with just a really bad set of almost the perfect storm of events for Avaya, when it comes to revenue and things like that. Because I find it hard to believe that, they would have put these numbers together a few weeks ago and they said, oh my God, this looks bad. Let's go find another CEO and then hire somebody that quickly. So
what's interesting is that, Jim is indeed a financial person. He's very comfortable talking about things like EBITDA. He's very comfortable talking about the numbers in general. I don't think I've ever heard him do a keynote where he didn't talk about EBITDA. And so he's the financial guy, and Alan is more, as you said, more of the technical visionary, and he's going to do some interesting things, and Avaya needs help around that. But what's interesting is going back to this comment about the rules have changed, and now the focus is on profitability. That's when you want the numbers guy in charge, right? But but they're kind of at a step, and so they're bringing in the visionary guy. Alan is indeed a visionary, and he's well regarded. I mean, just watching Twitter and stuff. Yes. So many of the people like us and the analyst community, but so many people have such high regard for Alan, and so I think he's going to do really well there. But it's interesting that they're on that, on this different step. The question that's been coming up is can Alan avoid Chapter 11? Chapter 11 again, or Chapter 11 Redux, or whatever you want to call it. They've got over $3 billion in debt. They're coming up short on these numbers, and so the question that they've already announced a fairly significant cost-cutting measure. They said cost-cutting measure that will impact the company's overall selling, general and administrative expenses, as well as discretionary spending. We're not looking likely at any acquisitions here in the near term. And so what can Alan really do? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've thought about that, and I do wonder if you're right. They do have a lot of debt, and they have a lot of short-term debt too, right? The $800 million convert. So I think he's got to find a way to squeeze a little bit of money out of this. I know, when he made his he did find some really good acquisitions that were pretty cheap when it was at Vonage for companies that kind of flew under the radar and added to the profitability line. So I'm wondering if he's going to be looking for something like that. I don't know how many more of those there are out there, though.
There's always companies like that out there, but I think it's important that Alan does know how to do acquisitions. I mean, I think the major acquisition that Jim did during his term was the Spoken one, which I don't think really contributed much to their top line, and so. But Alan does have a knack for acquisition. So if he can find the money and do one and find something, then what we're saying here is a lot of companies are undervalued. I'm not sure if he needs to avoid Chapter 11, to be honest. He's I'm thinking from Alan's perspective, he really can't lose. He either does an amazing turnaround job and becomes a famous turnaround expert, or it's too late and he couldn't fix it. He's really got nothing to lose. And if he goes into Chapter 11, he goes into Chapter 11. Certainly Jim was there before Chapter 11, and he came out of Chapter 11 much stronger, actually, than he went into Chapter 11. And so it wouldn't be necessarily the end of the world. It would be nice if they could avoid it, but I'm not sure. Alan doesn't have any.
Well, Dave, all this comes down to can they grow the company, right? And if you remember when Avaya first went private, way back, when Don Peterson ran the company, they were a $6 billion revenue company, and so it was twice as big in revenue, but they were twice as much debt. And they couldn't grow, and eventually your debt to revenue ratio becomes too big. And then they went to Chapter 11, and they came out of it. They couldn't grow your debt to revenue ratio. So all this comes down, can they grow and can they make money? And, Alan, I think, is a pedigree in doing that. But the other question that's come up, Dave, is people have asked me, do I think Alan's just here to sell the company? But I don't think it's the case. I think if that was the case, they would have hired somebody like Peter Leave, right? Who does that? And Alan's a builder, though. So
Avaya really needs a roadmap. Really needs a technical roadmap, and they've had a lot of turnover at Avaya in the technical side, and so I think Alan's going to come in and get a roadmap. But I also think we're going to see over the next 6 months an extreme amount of change at Avaya. I mean, Jim was there during Kevin Kennedy, and they were good friends. And in fact, Kevin Kennedy talks about him in his book. And so the transition to whenever a CEO changes, there's always a lot of changes that go with it. But they were more or less from the same camp. But Alan's going to change a lot. I mean, I think it's going to be fascinating. It's going to be interesting. Hold on to your hat. There's some great people at Avaya that I think are going to benefit really well. There's a lot of other people at Avaya that probably aren't going to survive this, but I think that we're going to see a tremendous amount of transformation occurring at Avaya over the next 6 months. Tremendous.
Yeah, well, I hope so, right? Because clearly, what's going on there now isn't working, and so if he doesn't change, then he's not doing his job, right? So that's the one thing we should hope for, actually, is that he does change quite a bit.
All right.
Yeah, so that wraps up week 30 of Real Time Recorded. I guess we missed a couple weeks, but boy, did we catch a lot of news in 1 week, Dave.
Very good.
Hopefully we'll be back next week for week 31, and I doubt we'll have something as big as this, but I'm sure we'll have something to talk about.
Thanks.